Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. Though, really, parts of it never quite left us so. If you're lying in bed right now, lights dimmed, maybe wondering why we still shake hands, queue politely, or wear white at weddings, a lot of that nonsense comes from people who believed bathing too often was hazardous to the soul. We're talking about medieval rules we still follow for no reason. Some of them are charming, most of them are strange, and a few are just the leftover crumbs of superstition slowly rotting in the modern world. So, settle in, pull up your blanket, and let's wander quietly through 1,000 years of bad ideas that somehow became tradition. Let's start with something simple: handshakes. That friendly little gesture, polite, supposedly respectful, has its roots in deep medieval paranoia. Back in the days when everyone had at least one dagger within stabbing distance, showing your open palm was the equivalent of saying, "Look, I'm not about to kill you." It wasn't affection. It was self-defense theater. Knights, merchants, even peasants would extend their hands as a way of proving they were unarmed. It said, "See? No sword, no knife, no sudden betrayal, at least not yet." And of course, because humans love to ritualize everything, it became formalized. By the 14th century, the handshake wasn't just a greeting, it was a contract gesture. Two men, and yes, it was always men, because equality hadn't been invented yet, would clasp hands to seal a deal. They didn't sign papers. They shook hands and hoped the other guy didn't die of the plague before Tuesday. Now, centuries later, we still do it, even though, statistically speaking, it's now more dangerous than it was in the plague years. At least then, they had the courtesy to die before they could infect a whole office. And speaking of polite infection, let's drift over to table manners specifically. The act of saying "bless you" when someone sneezes. You probably already know the rumor that it started during the Black Death. Someone sneezed, and people thought it meant their lungs were moments from so you gave them a small spiritual head start. Bless you, as in, you might be dead in 48 hours, but at least your soul's covered. That's not entirely wrong. During the 6th century plague in Italy, Pope Gregory I supposedly ordered that sneezing should be met with a blessing, an attempt to spiritually quarantine an epidemic. But even earlier, in Roman times, sneezing was seen as the soul trying to escape. The phrase "bless you" was meant to politely glue it back in, because of course it was. Fast forward to now. We still say "bless you" even when we're not particularly religious, even when we've just sneezed due to dust. It's polite superstition, social etiquette fossilized, a verbal handshake for our lungs. Let's move from sneezing to not sneezing, because we're about to talk about hygiene, or, more accurately, the complete absence of it. Medieval people had some deeply creative beliefs about cleanliness. Bathing too often, they thought, could open the pores, which apparently allowed sin and sickness to crawl in. Water, they believed, was not cleansing it, was suspiciously tempting. So, instead, they covered themselves in linen undergarments that supposedly wicked away impurities. These garments absorbed sweat, filth, and despair. People would then simply change their linens instead of washing their bodies. And somehow, out of that era of soapy negligence, we inherited the idea of modesty around bathing. Even today, people apologize for being in their towels, as though a robe is some sacred protection against scandal. It's a leftover instinct from a culture that thought nudity was spiritually dangerous and water was suspiciously French. Now, here's a fun one. The royal "we" you know when a monarch says, we are not amused, or we have decided to invade France again, because what else is there to do on a Wednesday? That habit didn't come from modesty or teamwork. It came from theological delusion. Medieval kings were considered gods, representatives on earth. Their bodies were thought to contain two forms, the mortal body and the divine body politic. So, when a monarch spoke, they weren't just representing themselves, they were channeling a kind of holy corporation. Thus, and the habits stuck. Even today, politicians and CEOs use we to spread personal responsibility across a vague, invisible crowd. It's the linguistic equivalent of blaming your imaginary friend for war crimes. While we're still among the royals, let's talk about heraldry, the elaborate business of putting lions, crosses, and mildly depressed birds on everything in the medieval world. Illiteracy was rampant. So, if you couldn't read, you looked for a symbol: 3 golden lions for England, a bunch of fleur-de-lis for France, a vaguely drunk eagle for the Holy Roman Empire. These designs became the world's first logos. Every noble family had one, and they were serious about them. People went to war over whether a lion was facing left or right. Fast forward a few centuries, and that obsession with insignia became brand culture. Logos, flags, school emblems, they're all heraldic children. We still wear little badges to declare allegiance, though now it's usually to Starbucks or Nike. Instead of a feudal lord, the peasants of 1350 would be deeply confused, but also, probably, impressed by the consistency of our devotion. Next, let's drift softly into the topic of marriage. Medieval marriage wasn't about love, it was about property, power, and making sure the bloodline remained slightly less diluted than the average soup. Yet, from this deeply unromantic system, we inherited several modern rituals. For instance, the wedding ring. Romans wore iron bands to signify ownership. Christians later turned it into a symbol of faithfulness. Medieval Europeans combined the two, giving us the spiritual handcuff we know today. And then there's the white dress. People think it's ancient, but it's really a Victorian invention, revived from medieval symbolism. In medieval Europe, white represented purity, but also, interestingly, mourning, which, depending on your marriage, might still be accurate. Another leftover, the idea of chivalry, that noble code of honor knights supposedly followed, except they didn't. Chivalry was less about rescuing maidens, and more about regulating upper-class violence. Knights were basically licensed thugs. The church invented chivalry as a PR campaign. Maybe, instead of burning villages, you could pray, or at least burn smaller villages. What began as a behavioral leash for medieval warlords somehow became the backbone of modern etiquette. Be polite, open doors. Don't stab anyone at dinner. Congratulations, you're being chivalrous.n now. Something that affects nearly all of us. Work schedules. The 9-to-5 workday isn't medieval itself, but the concept of regimented labor hours absolutely is. Monks invented it. The Benedictine order, around the 6th century, divided their day into canonical hours. They prayed at dawn, worked in the fields, prayed again, ate a disappointing meal, prayed again, and then finally slept. The schedule was rigid. Life was an unending calendar, notification from God. When monasteries became the intellectual centers of Europe, their rhythm bled into secular life. Even today, office workers follow the faint echo of monkish discipline. Except, instead of chanting psalms, we just refresh our email. Let's talk about food, because even our table customs are medieval ghosts. Forks, for example. They weren't common in Europe until the 11th century, and when they arrived, people were furious about them. Theologians declared that using a fork was unnatural. Food was meant to be touched by the fingers God gave you, not impaled with tiny metal tridents. It took centuries for forks to become acceptable. In fact, some early adopters were mocked relentlessly for using them because, of course, the human race has always hated innovation. Now, we can't imagine eating without one. Although, curiously, some people still stab their salad with the same aggression medieval knights used on each other. Speaking of food, salt. That simple white mineral shaped medieval society in ways we barely understand now. It preserved meat, paid salaries, and determined trade routes. To be worth your salt was literally an economic measure. Asterisk. Salt was placed in the center of the noble table, separating high-status guests from low-status ones. If you sat above the salt, you were important. Below it you were tolerated. That invisible hierarchy lingers in our manners today. We still care where we sit. We still measure importance by proximity to the head of the table, the boss, the spotlight. 1,000 years later, and we're still quietly arranging ourselves above the salt. Let's drift toward the legal system. Because, well, that's where things get properly absurd. Trial by ordeal was a favorite medieval pastime. If you were accused of theft or witchcraft, you could prove your innocence by holding a red-hot iron, plunging your hand into boiling water, or being thrown into a river. The logic was simple. God would protect the innocent. He rarely did. Yet from this nonsense, we inherited a peculiar concept, the presumption of justice through processed that the method of judgment is what makes it fair, not necessarily the outcome. Today, we've replaced boiling water with lawyers, but the faith in the system remains surprisingly similar. It's still more about ritual than reason. And now, one of my personal favorites, the royal touch. For centuries, kings and queens claimed they could heal diseases, especially scrofula, a tubercular infection of the neck, simply by touching the afflicted. Crowds would line up, desperate for a sweaty graze from the monarch's divine fingers. It was equal parts medical fraud and public relations. The belief endured for hundreds of years. Charles II of England reportedly touched over 100,000 people during his reign. Naturally, none of them were cured. But people kept coming because when the world is irrational, even royal germs seem holy. Today, the ritual survives in subtler form. Think of politicians kissing babies, celebrities blessing fans with selfies. It's all the same hunger for magic through proximity. Finally, let's end part 1 with something comforting in its absurdity. The calendar itself. We still organize our lives around an arbitrary Roman Christian system designed for agricultural monks. Months of unequal length, a random leap year, and holidays scattered by PayPal whim and pagan leftovers. February exists because Julius Caesar thought months should line up with the moon. Then Augustus changed it because he wanted his month August to be just as long as Julius's. So they stole a day from February. And that's why February is short. Because of Roman ego, we live by it. We set alarms by it. We schedule dentist appointments by the wounded pride of a dead emperor. So, as you drift off tonight, remember, the rules you follow were written by monks, lords, and lunatics. Your handshake is a truce from the Dark Ages. Your fork is a rebellion against the church. Your 9 to 5 is a monastic punishment. And your calendar is an act of imperial vanity. Tonight, we're drifting back to Renaissance Rome, a city of art, marble, and overwhelming moral confusion. So, if you're lying in bed, maybe the room's a little dark, and you're just trying to let your mind quiet down, this one's a gentle drift through the very strange, very human chaos that was Papal-era Rome. This was the time when the church was rich, artists were starving, and everyone else was somewhere in between, usually in confession. It's a world painted by Raphael, ruled by the Borgias, and morally policed by men who, frankly, should not have been left alone near a wine cellar. A time when holiness was measured in gold leaf and side lovers. So, let's dim the lights, settle in, and wander softly through the scandals that made the eternal city so very earthly. The Renaissance is often described as a rebirth of beauty and intellect, which it was if you ignored the screaming, the poisonings, and the occasional bishop falling off a balcony in his undergarments. Rome in the 15th and 16th centuries was not just a religious capital, it was a power broker, a stage for the greatest show of wealth and corruption Europe had ever seen. And at the center of it all were the popes, men who were supposed to embody spiritual purity, but instead embodied something closer to a very expensive midlife crisis. Let's begin gently with Pope Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia, because if you're going to talk about scandal, you might as well start with the man who turned the papacy into a family business. Rodrigo Borgia became pope in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west and ruined everyone's maps. Rodrigo, meanwhile, was busy ruining the papal reputation. He wasn't the first pope to have mistresses, but he was certainly the most enthusiastic. He had several children, all quite openly acknowledged, which was frowned upon, but not exactly rare. Everyone else in Rome was doing the same thing. Rodrigo just had better PR. His most famous offspring were Cesare and Lucretia Borgia, who would later be accused of every sin short of inventing sin itself. Cesare was the ambitious, one part cardinal, part warlord, and all ego. Lucretia was the beautiful, one used as a diplomatic bargaining chip in a series of strategic marriages. Rome adored to gossip about them. The rumor mill claimed that the Borgias held wild banquets, that they poisoned rivals, that they conducted certain family activities better left unnamed. Were the rumors true? Not all of them. But the important thing is that they could have been, because the Borgias had that particular kind of energy, where even the wildest stories felt plausible. Rodrigo was known to host banquets where courtesans danced between the dinner plates. At one such event, delicately titled The Banquet of Chestnuts, 50 dancers, reportedly stripped down to compete for prizes among the guests. The judges, naturally, were cardinals. It was Rome's version of a networking event. And somehow, this was all happening in the Apostolic Palace. Now, before you imagine that this was unique to Rodrigo, let's drift over to his papal colleagues. Because the Renaissance papacy was less a line of holy men and more a dynasty of dangerously bored aristocrats. Consider Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned before Rodrigo, the same Sixtus who built the Sistine Chapel, the one Michelangelo later painted. Sixtus was a man of contradictions. On one hand, a patron of art. On the other, a man who used church funds to bribe, murder, and secure positions for his nephews. He had so many nephews that historians started calling them his nephews with quotation marks. Asterisk, the word nepotism, by the way, comes from this exact practice, from nepot, meaning nephew, because popes kept giving jobs to their relatives, who may or may not have shared their DNA. And yes, Sixtus was implicated in the Pazzi conspiracy, an assassination attempt against the Medici family. It failed, of course. One of the assassins tried to stab Lorenzo de' Medici during Mass and missed, which, symbolically, was the Renaissance. In a nutshell, beautiful setting, terrible execution. After the Borgias came Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope. He wore armor, he led troops, he swore like a mercenary and commissioned Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling out of what appears to have been pure spite. Julius had fathered a daughter before taking holy vows, which raised eyebrows. But honestly, Rome was too tired by then to care. Everyone had a child somewhere. The only real scandal was if you didn't. Julius' temper was legendary. He once threatened to excommunicate the entire city of Bologna because they wouldn't pay him taxes fast enough. He was also known to curse in 4 languages. Truly a man of the Renaissance. But while Julius was busy collecting art and enemies, the church continued to expand its understanding of morality. Let's pause on that for a moment and look at Renaissance morality, which was something of a philosophical gymnastic routine. The church preached chastity but owned brothels. Yes, genuinely, officially managed and taxed ones. Even the prophets were considered a necessary evil. A moral loophole so large you could march an entire army of cardinals through it. Asterisk. Courtesans were celebrities in Rome. They were educated, witty, beautifully dressed, and often sponsored by cardinals who enjoyed long theological debates. Among other activities, one of the most famous was Imperiale de Campo, who was said to have the face of an angel and the negotiation skills of a bank. She entertained princes, poets, and high-ranking clergy. Rumor had it she could recite Latin poetry mid-seduction, which, depending on your tastes, is either deeply romantic or deeply terrifying. Of course, none of this scandal existed in a vacuum. It was all wrapped in art and marble. While Michelangelo sculpted saints, the saints themselves were behaving more like politicians at a villa party. Painters relied on the church for money, which created interesting dynamics. For example, Raphael painted several Madonnas whose faces bore a striking resemblance to the same Roman mistress he was sleeping with at the time. Everyone noticed. No one complained, because the art was that good. The boundary between sacred and profane blurred into one long fresco of wishful thinking. Then came Pope Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, the famous Lorenzo the Magnificent. Leo was, predictably, magnificent in his spending. He loved banquets, theatre, and elaborate animal parades. He once staged a show featuring a live elephant that bowed before him. The elephant died a few weeks later from poor treatment, which was both tragic and very on brand for Renaissance Rome. Leo's reign was one of indulgence and denial. While the church's coffers emptied, Leo kept throwing parties. He sold indulgences to raise money, which, as you might recall, directly inspired a rather angry German monk named Martin Luther to start writing notes and nailing them to doors. In short, Leo partied so hard he accidentally created Protestantism. Meanwhile, his cardinals were competing in their own games of wealth and sensuality. One of the more notorious was Cardinal Bibbiena, who wrote erotic comedies and insisted they were moral allegories. The Renaissance had a way of rebranding its vices as aesthetic experiences. A brothel was a salon, adultery was courtly love, and power-hungry nobles were patrons of humanism. It's the sort of mental gymnastics that only a culture steeped in both Aristotle and wine could maintain. And then there was Pope Paul III, a man so entangled in nepotism that half the Vatican payroll was technically family. He appointed his teenage grandsons as cardinals because, why not? One of them was 14. Another was 13. Both reportedly spent their first few months of clerical service playing dice in the apostolic palace. Paul himself had several mistresses before his papacy, including one memorable affair with a married noblewoman that produced 5 children. When he eventually rose to the papal throne, he brought them all along, as though the Vatican were a family reunion that got out of hand to his credit. Paul also launched the Council of Trent, which reformed many of the Church's worst abuses, though by the time he started cleaning up, most of the mess had been created by him and his friends. Now, one might wonder, how did all of this look to the average Roman? The answer is familiar. Scandal was entertainment. The people knew their leaders were corrupt, but corruption was simply how the system worked. Much like now, outrage was a spectator sport. Romans gossiped in taverns about papal mistresses the same way we discuss celebrity affairs today. They swapped rumors of secret tunnels, late-night visits, and forbidden liaisons in the papal gardens, and sometimes the stories were true. There were whispers that Lucretia Borgia possessed a hollow ring filled with poison, whispers that cardinals held masked banquets where moral boundaries became theoretical, and whispers that the holy relic trade had quietly devolved into an arms race of absurdity. By 1500, you could purchase everything from a feather of the Holy Spirit to a piece of the true cross so large that, if reassembled, the cross would have been roughly the size of a cathedral. The fascinating thing about these scandals is how openly they coexisted with genuine genius. The same city that gave us Machiavelli, Michelangelo, and Galileo also gave us bishops who maintained entire harems. Rome was both brilliant and broken, saintly and scandalous all at once, and maybe that's what made it so irresistibly human, because the Renaissance wasn't just an age of enlightenment. It was also an age of excuses. Every great artist, every powerful pope, every glamorous courtesan, they all believed they were living through something special. And they were. They were living in a time when beauty could justify almost anything. Let's drift, quietly now, to the later years of the 16th century. The tide began to turn. Reform was in the air. The Counter-Reformation took hold. Rome began scrubbing its conscience, one fresco at a time. Paintings of voluptuous saints were discreetly censored. Nude figures in the Sistine Chapel gained modest fig leaves, painted by an artist who became known rather unfairly as the breeches maker. Morality, once an afterthought, became fashionable again. But by then, the damage had been done. The papal courts had already lived their most extravagant century. The rumors would never die, and maybe that's fitting, because even as the Renaissance tried to elevate humanity toward divine perfection, the people at its core were spectacularly, consistently, wonderfully human. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture Rome not as marble perfection, but as a living contradiction, a city where cardinals prayed and schemed in the same breath, where popes blessed armies before battle, where courtesans recited scripture between sonnets. It was messy, dazzling, and absurd, and somehow, from all that chaos, came the art and architecture we still marvel at today. Maybe that's the secret of history, that even the holiest ages were built by deeply imperfect people. And maybe perfection, if it ever existed, would be terribly boring. Asterisk to the echo of hooves on sand, the smell of sweat and dust, and the faint roar of 100,000 Romans, all pretending they had better lives than they actually did. We're going to talk about the Auriga, the Roman charioteer, the speed demons of antiquity, the celebrity athletes of an empire that was both astonishingly sophisticated and uncomfortably unhygienic. If you're lying there under the covers, maybe a little restless, don't worry, tonight's story isn't about war, or death, or emperors stabbing each other in the Senate. It's about something far more soothing, a sport that was basically NASCAR. If NASCAR involved slavery, superstition, and catastrophic spinal injuries, so get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want, and let's drift back to the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus was Rome's largest stadium. At its peak, it could seat allegedly over 150,000 people. That's roughly the population of a small modern city, all squeezed together on wooden benches, eating stale bread and yelling at horses. The arena was a vast, sandy oval lined with marble starting gates, and split down the middle by a raised divider called the spina. The spina was decorated with statues, obelisks, and various objects that looked sacred but were really there to distract you from the fact that people were dying for entertainment. And at the center of this thunderous theater was the Auriga. The charioteer, he was small, wiry, and perpetually tense. He held 4 horses by leather reins that wrapped around his waist, which, if you think about it, wasn't great for safety. If the chariot flipped, he would be dragged at high speed until someone stopped the horses, or until physics did. The Auriga's job was simple: survive 7 laps. Ideally, faster than everyone else. Ideally, still attached to the chariot by the end. Asterisk now. Chariot racing wasn't just a pastime, it was a religion. And like all Roman things, it was also political. The races were organized into teams, called factiones, each with its own colors: the reds, the blues, the greens, and the whites. And people took their color allegiance seriously. Fistfights, riots, arson, all over which group of horses crossed the line first. It's comforting, in a way, to know that human beings have always been this ridiculous. Supporters would paint their faces, chant, and accuse rival teams of witchcraft. Because of course they did. The emperors, meanwhile, used the races to keep the public entertained and distracted. As long as the crowds were busy screaming about the greens and blues, they weren't screaming about taxes, famine, or yet another war in the East. Bread and circuses, as the saying went. Free food, free death, and enough noise to drown out the smell of reality. The Auriga himself, though, usually wasn't free. Most of them were slaves, bought young, trained hard, and thrown into the arena as expendable entertainment. But if they survived, and if they won, oh, they could become rich. Astoundingly rich. There were cases of former slaves earning fortunes that rivaled senators. One charioteer, Gaius Appuleius Diocles, is often cited as the highest-paid athlete in history. By the time he retired, he'd reportedly earned the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. He raced for over 20 years, won more than 1,000 races, and managed to do it without dying, which, statistically speaking, was his greatest achievement. He also did what most ancient athletes did when they became rich. He built statues of himself. Lots of them, because modesty wasn't invented yet. Asterisk. Life as a charioteer was an odd mix of danger, glory, and superstition. Before each race, Erige performed rituals to the gods, especially Neptune, patron of horses, and Fortuna, patron of luck. They tied charms to their harnesses, whispered to their horses, and occasionally consulted astrologers about which direction their luck was turning. Superstition in ancient Rome was less a personality trait and more a lifestyle. If your chariot broke, it wasn't bad craftsmanship, it was evil spirits. If your opponent won, he hadn't trained harder, he'd used black magic. And if you were injured, well, you probably deserved it for looking at a crow the wrong way. The races themselves were organized chaos. 12 chariots per race, each trying to squeeze into the sharp turn at the meta. The turning posts at each end of the spina. The trick was to stay as close to the post as possible without clipping it. Too wide, and you'd lose time. Too tight, and you'd be painting the track with your spleen. Chariots were lightweight and fragile wooden frames, thin wheels, and horses that weighed half a ton each. When crashes happened, and they always did, they were called naufragia or shipwrecks. Because once the chariot overturned, there was no steering, no control, just chaos. Spectators loved it. Nothing delighted a Roman crowd like the sudden thud of a man meeting sand at 40 miles per hour. And when an auriga fell, the others rarely stopped. They couldn't. Stopping meant dying too. It's worth pausing here to remember that this wasn't fringe entertainment. This was mainstream. Emperors attended. Senators bet fortunes. Children grew up idolizing their favorite charioteers, the way modern kids idolize football stars or pop singers. Merchants sold figurines and oil lamps with chariot designs. Women wore jewelry in team colors. There were even graffiti messages, things like "Marcus won the day," "He drives like the wind," and, more ominously, "Lucius, you owe me 10 denarii," because wherever there's sport, there's gambling. Romans gambled on everything. Which horse would lead the first lap? Which color would crash first? Which auriga would live? They were betting not just on skill, but on fate, and on the thrilling possibility that their favorite might not survive the night. The auriga's relationship with his horses was, surprisingly, the most tender part of his life. These weren't disposable animals, they were teammates. The best charioteers knew their horses by name, talked to them, trained with them, even slept near the stables before big races. Roman writers mention famous horses with names like Aratus, Golden One, Spina, Candidus, and Tenex. They had their own fan followings. Sometimes, after a particularly famous win, the horses were given wreaths and statues too. A man might die nameless in the sand, but the horses lived on in poetry, and if that sounds sentimental, well, the Romans could beat. When it came to their animals, at least. Their humans, not so much. When an auriga grew too old or too injured to race, he often became a trainer or a stable master. Those who had earned their freedom sometimes bought shares in racing stables, turning from property into proprietors, but few ever truly escaped the shadow of the track. For all its glamour, chariot racing was addictive. The roar of the crowd, the wind, the chance, no matter how slim, of immortality. Even retired racers were known to linger around the stables, like old soldiers listening for the sound of distant drums. And the emperors, oh, they couldn't resist it either. Emperor Caligula, in his infinite restraint, once built a marble stable for his favorite horse, Incitatus, and planned to make him a consul. It's unclear whether that was meant as a joke or a threat. Nero, on the other hand, took things further. He fancied himself a charioteer, though he was spectacularly bad at it. During one race, Nero was thrown from his chariot, but since he was emperor, the judges declared him the winner anyway. A decision that historians agree was both politically wise and athletically ridiculous. The sport lasted for centuries long after the gladiatorial games began to fade. Even as Christianity spread and Rome turned toward the cross, the Circus Maximus continued to draw crowds. By the time of Theodosius, the late 4th century emperor who officially banned pagan games, chariot racing was too deeply rooted to kill. It lingered well into the Byzantine Empire. In fact, in Constantinople, the races took on new life. The blues and greens became politofactions, and their rivalry occasionally turned into open revolt, most famously in the Nika riots, where tens of thousands were killed because people got a little too emotional about sports. Some things never change. So, what was life really like for a charioteer? It depended on the day. In the morning, he'd wake in the stables, the smell of straw and horses thick in the air. He'd check the harnesses, rub oil into his hands, and whisper quiet words to the horses, not affection, exactly, but something between camaraderie and superstition. He'd eat lightly grain olives, maybe dried figs, nothing too heavy. Then he'd wrap the reins around his waist, stand in the chariot, and wait for the trumpet call. The gates would fly open, and in that moment, every sound disappeared, the crowd, the city, the world. Only the sand, the wind, and the pounding rhythm of 4 hearts in sync. 7 laps of danger, glory, and dust. And if he won, the city would scream his name. If he lost, well, at least the crowd got a good show. To us, the charioteer feels distant, almost mythical. But he wasn't. He was a working man, a risk-taker, a performer balancing life and death in a wooden frame. He didn't fight for empire or politics. He fought for the fleeting chance to matter for 7 laps, under the Roman sun, and maybe that's why the crowds loved him. Because for a few minutes, as the horses thundered round the track, everyone in the stands could forget who they were, citizen or slave, senator or beggar, and just exist in that mad, glorious sound, the rhythm of hooves, the crack of reins, the endless circle of dust and applause. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that ancient roar fading into the distance. The crowd dissolves. The sand settles. The horses quiet down. Somewhere in the stables, an auriga sits in silence, hands raw, back aching, thinking of the next race. He knows he'll get up tomorrow, wrap the reins again, and tempt fate once more. Because to live as a charioteer was to live entirely in motion, and to stop, finally, was to be forgotten, asterisk, not the Instagram-filtered version with golden sunsets and clean pyramids, but the Egypt of engineers, priests, and a river that refused to behave. So go ahead and dim the lights. Settle in, because tonight's story isn't about pharaohs shouting orders from their gold-plated thrones, or about mysterious curses that turn archaeologists into headlines. It's about something much quieter, the long, patient, and slightly obsessive project of trying to control the Nile. The Nile was, to put it gently, the best and worst roommate in human history. It brought life, food, and trade. And it also brought mud, mosquitoes, and floods that casually erased entire villages, every year, like clockwork, or more accurately, like a clock that occasionally forgot what year it was. The river would swell, spill over, and recede. When it behaved, the floods left behind rich black silt. When it didn't, they drowned everything you owned so naturally. The ancient Egyptians did what humans always do when faced with a temperamental natural system. They tried to engineer their way out of it. Now, the Egyptians didn't invent irrigation, but they did perfect the art of pretending they had, By around 3000 BC, they were already digging canals, ditches, and basins, a kind of ancient plumbing network designed to trap the Nile's excess water and then release it politely when the crops were thirsty. These early engineers didn't have modern tools, of course. No bulldozers, no pumps. Just manpower, lots of it, and the kind of stubborn optimism only a civilization dependent on mud could have. Their system was called basin irrigation. It worked like this. When the flood came, they channeled the water into large walled fields called basins. There, it would sit quietly soaking into the soil, depositing its silt, and occasionally breeding a few dozen species of unpleasant insects. Then, once the water drained away, they'd plant wheat and barley in the newly nourished ground. Simple, elegant, extremely labor-intensive. But it worked. For over 4,000 years, the Nile's flood pattern dictated Egypt's economy, religion, and sense of humor, of course. Whenever something in ancient Egypt worked, someone had to take credit for it. Enter the pharaohs. They didn't build the irrigation networks themselves. They were far too busy commissioning statues of themselves, pretending to be gods. But they made sure everyone knew who to thank for the annual flood. If the river rose properly, it was because the pharaoh was righteous, blessed, and cosmically tidy. If it didn't, it was because someone somewhere had angered the gods, and usually that someone was not the pharaoh. Priests kept careful records of the Nile's behavior in what were called nilometers, stone staircases carved into the riverbanks, marked with measuring lines. These measured the height of the floodwaters, which conveniently also measured how much tax everyone would pay. If the water rose high, lots of crops, lots of taxes. If it stayed low, less food, and far less enthusiasm about taxes. In short, the Nile was both nature's calendar and the government's accountant. Now, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a personality. The Egyptians called it Hapi, the god of fertility and abundance. They didn't imagine him as a fierce warrior or a thunderous deity, but as a plump, blue-green man with water lilies in his hair. Essentially, a divine version of your cheerful, slightly soggy uncle. Hapi's job was to ensure the yearly flood came on time. If he slacked off, priests held ceremonies to remind him who paid for the temples. Offerings, songs, and elaborate rituals were all part of the persuasion campaign. Imagine standing at the riverbank, chanting to the water while your neighbor mutters, "Maybe we should just dig a bigger canal next year." And eventually they did, as Egyptian dynasties rose and fell. Each ruler tried to leave their mark on the Nile. Some tried to improve irrigation systems. Others just renamed them. The pharaoh Amenhotep III, for instance, around 1800 BCE, oversaw one of the largest waterworks projects in Egyptian history. He focused on a vast natural depression called the Fayum, a region west of the Nile that was both a potential breadbasket and a potential swamp. Depending on the day, Amenhotep's engineers expanded a connecting canal known as the Be'er Yusuf, Joseph's Canal, though Joseph himself was very much not involved, and built sluices and dikes to regulate the flow of water from the Nile into the Fayum basin. This wasn't just irrigation. It was landscape architecture on a geological scale. They turned a temperamental floodplain into a controlled agricultural zone. And because this was Egypt, they naturally followed it up by building temples to congratulate themselves. But as impressive as these works were, the Nile always had the final say. No matter how carefully the Egyptians measured, planned, or prayed, the river had moods. Sometimes it rose too high, washing away years of effort. Other times it stayed maddeningly low, leaving canals dry and harvests thin. The Nile's flood came from rainfall far to the south in Ethiopia, a place most Egyptians had never seen. So when the water levels failed, no one knew why. They blamed the gods, of course, or foreigners, or possibly both, because divine displeasure was a far easier explanation than hydrological variability. Let's drift forward a little to the Greek and Roman eras. By then, Egypt was less an independent civilization and more a prized possession in other people's empires. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers, pretending very hard to be Egyptian, continued the tradition of Nile management. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus for example, loved big projects. He built new canals, extended harbors, and founded the city of Alexandria, which became the ancient world's premier combination of library and humidity trap under his rule. The engineers even tried to connect the Nile to the Red Sea, an early ancestor of the Suez Canal. It worked, sort of. Then it silted up repeatedly, which was Egypt's way of reminding people who was actually in charge. By the time the Romans took over in 30 BCE, Egypt was considered the empire's personal grain silo. The Nile's floods still mattered, but now they mattered to people in Rome who had never seen the river, and certainly didn't care about its moods. Roman engineers tinkered with the canals, improving some, abandoning others. They built stone dams and reservoirs, some of which still exist, quietly outliving the empire that built them, but mostly, they treated the Nile like a divine bread dispenser, pushed the right buttons, get grain for the legions. They never quite understood how delicate the system was, how centuries of local knowledge balanced flood, soil, and season. When Roman administrators meddled too much, fields went dry. When they meddled too little, villages drowned. A perfect bureaucratic middle ground was never achieved. Through all of this, the Egyptian farmers, the Feloine, were the real masters of the Nile. They read its currents, tracked its color, and smelled the air before the floods came. To them, engineering wasn't about blueprints or temples. It was about survival. They rebuilt canals every season, cleared silt by hand, watched for signs the first appearance of certain birds. The reddish tint of the water that meant the flood was near. The government might take credit, but it was the farmers who kept Egypt alive, and they did it with the quiet, weary efficiency of people who had stopped expecting the gods or engineers to fix anything. Let's drift a little further, forward to the Islamic period, when medieval rulers took their turn at improving Egypt's watery temper. Cairo rose where Fustat once stood, and the caliphs inherited the same challenge the pharaohs had faced. Too much river one year, not enough the next. They repaired old canals, built new ones, and kept the nilometers in working order, still using them to measure water and, of course, taxes. One of the most famous nilometers still stands on Rhoda Island, a quiet stone column carved with Arabic inscriptions, marking the level of the floodwaters century after century. It's a beautiful monument, a ruler that measured both life and bureaucracy by the 19th century, though the Nile's fate entered the industrial age. Steam engines, telegraphs, and colonial administrators all arrived in the same suitcases. The British, naturally, decided they could manage the Nile better than anyone else ever had. They loved the idea of control, straight lines, dams, and schedules. The river, however, had other ideas. The first large dam, the Aswan Low Dam, was built around 1902. It was supposed to regulate floods and guarantee irrigation year-round. And it did. Sort of except for the part where it flooded villages, disrupted silt flow, and angered everyone who lived nearby. Small details easily overlooked when you're drawing maps in London. Engineers raised the dam twice, each time believing they'd finally mastered the Nile. Each time, the river shrugged politely and reminded them who owned the valley. Then came the Aswan High Dam, the modern centerpiece of Egypt's long obsession with taming its river. Finished in the 1970s, it was a triumph of concrete, politics, and mixed results. It created Lake Nasser, one of the largest artificial lakes in the world. It controlled floods, yes. It also displaced over 100,000 people, trapped nutrient-rich silt behind its walls, and introduced new problems no one had thought of yet. The Nile, once a living, breathing flood cycle, became a measured pulse of machinery. Crops grew year-round, but the soil grew tired. Fish stocks changed. The river's heartbeat slowed. Even in modern times, engineers have discovered the same truth their ancient counterparts knew. You can manage the Nile, but you can't own it. So tonight, as you're drifting off, imagine standing on the riverbank, somewhere between past and present. The air is warm. The water glows faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere, a farmer is listening for the first whisper of rising current, the ancient signal that the flood has come again. Behind him stretch 4,000 years of engineering, from hand-dug canals and stone nilometers to massive dams and satellite surveys, all built by people who believed, in their own quiet way, that they could coax a river into cooperation, and maybe they could for a while. But the Nile remains, as ever, a little beyond reach, a reminder that even the oldest civilizations are still at the mercy of water, silt, and time. Asterisk.